Hey guys, here we are in the middle of a beautiful German forest, and today I want to talk about not only the Fujifilm X-H1 but also the Sony Alpha A7 III. If you've been following my videos, you'll notice that I've been reviewing Fujifilm a lot. Their lenses, different camera bodies, and I really love this system. However, being quite active in the photography community, I keep hearing this name about the Sony Alpha series, in particular the A7 III. So I thought to myself, maybe there is something to this APS-C to full frame debate. And I've watched just about every video I could find about the Sony Alpha A7 III versus the Fujifilm X-H1. And none of them really nail down the comparison that I would like to see. So I'm going to do this review and review it through my eyes. So being a scientist, I want to find kind of the objective truth, if there is any, between these two cameras. Of course, it may be clouded by some subjective opinions of myself. However, I want to do my best. So I want to look at things like image quality. I want to look at the ergonomics of each camera, the electric viewfinder. I want to look at their autofocus capabilities. I want to look at the lens selection. I want to look at RAW versus JPEG, the color science, how easy it is to edit the photos, and how much shadow recovery I can get from each of the RAW files. Furthermore, I'm really interested in what functions that they offer. So what do the menus offer, and overall the video, and if there's any really defining differences between them. The low light capabilities have often been touted by the Sony, so I really want to also not only compare out here in the daytime shooting photographs, but also inside with low light conditions, and see if it's true that the full frame sensor of the A7 III really can outperform something like the X-H1. For this comparison, I've paired up my X-H1 with the 16-55 2.8. This is often regarded as the best zoom, one of the best zooms we could say for Fujifilm. People have called it a bag of primes, meaning that it's pretty good at almost every focal length, and it's 2.8 aperture throughout the focal length that it offers. For the Sony A7 III, which I'm now filming on, I have paired it with the 24-105 G series f4. So when you do the comparison from APS-C to full frame, you kind of multiply that focal length by 1.5 times, and therefore the 16-55 is about a 24-80, we could say. So it's pretty much, and it's f4. So it's pretty much the closest lens I could get, because I don't want to make this about the lens. Of course, Sony also makes the G Master series with f2.8, and that would actually give a thinner depth of field, and potentially be a better lens. That is not for me to review. I want to look at the cameras. So I tried to get as close as I could to the same type of lens, same kind of zoom range, and the same aperture. So when we're looking through these photographs later, that's something to keep in mind, that of course there are different lenses that you could use, and that might influence the sharpness or the contrast of an image. But those are not the things that I really want to focus on in this review. I more want to look at the camera as a package and go from there. So I'm going to go ahead and walk around this forest, take some photographs, also take some inside later, and then we'll meet back at my desk and kind of go over everything together. So stay tuned. Okay guys, what I want to show you, this is the first photo I took in the forest. Now, just looking at these two photos, I want you to guess which one is from Fuji and which one is from the Sony. It's quite hard, I would say. Turns out that the one on the left is from Sony and the one on the right is from Fuji. I tried to focus on this here for each image. So if we zoom into that, we can see that it looks like the Sony rendered this a little bit better, but again, I don't know, this is pretty close. These are both raw files and everything is pretty equal there. So I just want to give you a few of these and we can run through them. I'm going to hide it again, and you can again tell me which one you think is which. So here we have the next picture. Focus was on this tree in the background. So again, we have the two photographs. I want you to guess which one is the Sony and which one is the Fuji. In this case, again, we have on the left the Sony and on the right we have the Fuji. So here I think it's more apparent that the Sony rendered detail better. If we zoom in a little bit farther to both of them, I think it's much more clear that the Sony has rendered this detail better. On the Fuji it looks more of a little mushy, I could say. So let's go ahead and move along to the next photo. On the left, the Sony, and on the right we have the Fuji. So the focus was on this part of the plant. And if we take it a step farther, let's say 2:1. So here, yeah, it's pretty tough to say. I would say in this case, they both look pretty good. And I think that's a strength of the Fuji lens, at least, is that when you're at a closer distance, it seems to render detail much better than landscape with many different trees and things like this. I think if you have a single object, this lens really excels. But in this case, they're pretty similar. I can see some interesting chromatic aberration here actually on the Sony lens, which seems to not be present in the raw file of the Fuji. Anyway, there you go. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. I'm going to hide that. Here we are on the next one. The focus was here. Which one do you think is the Sony and which one is the Fuji? Turns out the one on the left again is the Sony and the one on the right is the Fuji. So pretty similar here once again. Let's go ahead and move on. So this one is one of the photos that I find to have the biggest differences. The focus was down here in the bottom right on this log. Now this could be a stump, sorry. This could be due to just the corner sharpness of the lens, but it's pretty apparent the difference here. So if we zoom in there, you can see on the Sony, it rendered that moss on the stump way better. It is quite apparent that this actually has some texture still, and this is very mushed out. A lot of people say that Fuji has a trouble with the greens, and this could be a case of that, or it could be a case that simply for this lens at 55 millimeters, the bottom right corner is not so strong, whereas if you're looking at the Sony lens, you're somewhere in the middle of the focal range, so it could be a case of this. If you think back to the first pictures I showed you, there wasn't such an apparent difference, but this is the result. So, and that's at 1/500th of a second, so it shouldn't be due to a handshake or anything like that, and I was quite steady on these photos. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. So here, a little different zoom, but the focus was on this bush down in the bottom left corner. Let's go ahead and zoom into said bush. So here again, there is quite a difference from the left to the right. The one on the right is so much better, and this is single point autofocus right here on this bush. So I don't know if you've already guessed it, but actually the one on the right is the Sony. This is another very big difference that I've saw in the photographs. Yes, and again, this is kind of middle focal range, whereas on the Fuji, you're looking at the maximum focal distance of that lens. So that could be one of the reasons. It could also be that, again, it's kind of near the corner, but I don't know. It's so much sharper there with the Sony. Okay, moving on to the next one. This is just kind of a large forest photograph, we could say. Actually, I was focusing on this tree kind of in the center here. So if we zoom into there, both of the photographs here, I'm not seeing such a great difference between either of the shots. Maybe if we can go 2:1, perhaps the one on the left has a little better rendering of the moss on the tree, but overall, I would say they're quite similar. Which ones are they? The left is the Sony and the right is Fuji. So if I zoom back out, this was kind of the overall shot and feel Fuji, of course, has a lot more warm colors in there, and I actually prefer the rendering of this photograph of the Fuji better than the Sony. Granted, they're both raw, and of course you can edit them however you like. That said, let's go ahead and move on. This is what I wanted to do with this photograph. I was going to see how well I can pull out the shadows. But as you see, the photograph on the right is already brighter than the one on the left, and that's because simply the lighting kind of changed. You see there's some more sunlight in the front here. But with that said, so without trying to make you guess, so the one on the left is Sony, the one on the right is Fuji. If I bump up the exposure in the photo on the left, so somewhat comparable. So I did 2 stops, and now we're kind of on the same page here. If I zoom in to the Fuji and I zoom into the Sony, it is quite a different story. I'm not sure if this is due to the detail rendered in a low light condition, but you can see the tree on the left, the bark is incredibly sharper. I mean, it's pretty much night and day. And keep in mind, that's already, I bumped this up 2 stops of exposure. Now, if I also take out some shadow, you can still see, I mean, the detail really is there in the Sony and it's not there in the Fuji. And that is surprising to have such a big difference for me. I mean, this shouldn't be based on the auto-focusing system or anything like that, because it's just single point focus on a tripod right in the middle of this tree. So yeah, that was a surprising one for me. So even with the additional development here, it seems like the Sony still was able to recover that detail better. If you think back to what that photograph looked like before I did any editing on it, it was pretty much a black tree. Actually, I'd be happy to put it back to the original just so you can see real quick. So you can see I pulled it out quite nicely and detail is still there. On the Fuji, the import looks like this. And of course, we were able to also pull out some nice light there. I can even, of course, bump it up 2 stops and get a lot of light, but the detail wasn't there in the tree. So that's something to keep an eye on when we go further into our low light tests. Now, I wanted to look at some of the low light situations. So this is inside of my room. I have a light on inside, but there isn't so much light source. So the ISO here is set on both photographs to 3200. If we zoom in to the photographs, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So you see that there is indeed some grain on these photographs. I want you to think which one is the Sony and which one is the Fuji. Of course, we would imagine that the Sony has better low light capabilities than the Fuji does. So I do see, I don't know if I actually see more grain here or if it's just has more exposure. I mean, there is quite a bit of grain here as well. In any case, the one on the left is Sony and the one on the right is Fuji. That said, for me, they aren't so different, though I would say that the Sony has a bit less grain than the Fuji there. Granted, again, this is simply brighter. So let's go ahead and move on to another photograph here. Okay, so here we are again, picture of a bunch of strings. Let's go ahead and dive right into the center of these photographs. Again, the ISO here is set to 3200. And on this case, you have the Sony on the right and the Fuji on the left. If I zoom in even a bit farther, I'm particularly noticing a difference in the blacks. You can see that the Fuji did a little more effort to pull some detail out of the black area, whereas the Sony seems to have kept the nice contrast of the black. Let's go ahead and look at the next one. Here we are. This is a piece of canvas. So you see there's a lot of texture on it, and I thought that would be interesting. So let's go ahead and lock them in, and let's look right here on the edge of this brush stroke. Let's go way in there. Let's see what we have. So I wouldn't say that one has necessarily more noise than the other one. I think the one on the right is brighter, and that might give the impression that it has more noise. But in the end, I'm not sure it does. Perhaps I'd give a slight edge to the one on the right. If you look at this point right here, it seems to be developed there, and whereas it's not developed there. However, I mean, come on, these are really, really close. And the one on the right would be from Fuji, and the one on the left would be from Sony. This is at ISO 6400 now, and it's at 1/1000th of a second shutter. So take what you want from that, but these look pretty close to me, which says a lot for this APS-C sensor of the Fujifilm X-H1. Let's go ahead and look at another one. So here we are again. This is obviously of a dartboard. So let's go ahead and dive into the image here. If I look really closely at the bullseye. So again, the one on the right is a bit brighter, so I would guess that's the Fuji, and it is. So we're at 6400 again. I'm not seeing such a big difference in the noise in that image, nor the sharpness. I think that's pretty impressive for the Fujifilm to keep up with the Sony in these indoor low light tests. So let's go ahead and look at one last image just of a lamp here. Let's zoom into them. See a lot of grain on this image, which is good because that's what we were looking at. Let's go ahead and get them in the same position. So in the black area here, I do see more, say, white specks than in the black area here. And I think in this case, the Fuji's on the left and the Sony's on the right. So yeah, if I would look in this black area, I would say there's a bit more noise here. However, if I look at the image itself, I'm not seeing any outstanding differences in sharpness. Maybe here you see this one strand. I mean, it's not fully rendered here, but I'm at 3:1 zoom at ISO 12800, which kind of concludes this low light testing. So one thing I've noticed people saying is that Sony doesn't have a good JPEG engine. And so what I wanted to do with these two photographs is show you kind of how Sony renders a standard JPEG. So on the left, we have the raw file, and on the right, we have the JPEG. So you can see it really brought out the shadows here, and I think put a little better warmth in this green moss on the tree. We can also look how it did some sharpening, so some slight sharpening there. And overall, I think this did a pretty good job. I'm not displeased with the result here. So for you JPEG shooters, I wouldn't immediately throw Sony out of the game given the JPEG engine. I have another example. So on the left, we have, again, the raw file, and on the right, we have the JPEG. So again, threw in some warm colors there. And I really like how it looks. I actually like the raw file also, but there you go. So I think that that is an acceptable rendering of a photograph. And I also, of course, I love Fuji's JPEGs. Often I feel I don't even need to touch them. They are so good. But this is just a look at Sony's JPEGs, and there you have it. I want to just talk a little bit about the Sony A7 III. So first things first, my first impression when holding this was that I was holding like a rectangular brick. Now I still kind of feel like that, but it has grown on me a bit. So the reason being is it does have this nice notch for the middle finger, which really makes my index finger land on that shutter button nicely. It also has a raised ridge here for my thumb to support against, so it feels okay in the hand. With that said, my pinky does hang off the bottom, and that is unfortunate because it kind of makes the camera feel like it's leaning towards the left. Of course, when I'm shooting, I will support the lens with my left hand, and it kind of removes that problem. So all in all, it's okay, I would say, ergonomically in the hand. It's not like a Fujifilm in that you'll have a lot of manual dials. You can't change your ISO through a knob, you can't change your shutter speed through a knob. So if that's something that you enjoy, if you're a very tactile, old school manual photographer, then this camera's probably not going to be for you. However, what it does offer is a lot of customization. So On the main knob, you of course have manual, shutter priority, aperture priority, things like this, auto. You have your video mode, but you also have 1 and 2, which are 2 customizable settings that remember everything about your menu setup, and it'll go directly into that. So you could have one set up, say, for 4K at 24p, and one for, say, 1080 at 120p, or you could have one for black and white and one for whatever. So that's customizable, and that's great. You also have this exposure knob here, which is pretty common in all the cameras. But what you also have are, you can change your aperture from the front wheel and your shutter speed from the back. You can also swap those if you so desire. But what I was getting to is it has a lot of customizable buttons. So you have C1, C2, C3, a function button, and a lot of other buttons, and they are all customizable. And I think that is a big plus for Sony. They really want you to make this camera work how you want it to work. Now, to do that, you really have to understand the menu system, and that brings us to the menu system. A lot of people are saying that it's very confusing and kind of overwhelming, and I do agree. I mean, when you click the button menu, you're approached with maybe 6 overarching categories, and each one of them has its own series of pages. With that said, what I do like about it is that the pages are completely viewable on the screen. What I mean is that you don't need to scroll down through them. All the options on that page are visible at once. So if you don't see it on that page, you just click to the next page. Now that's nice. So in comparison on the Fujifilm, you know, it might only have 3 pages for some category, but I have to scroll all the way through page 1, all the way through page 2, and then find what I wanted on page 3. So here I can just click right, and I'm on page 3. So I think overall the menu system's fine, and I think a lot of people might say it's confusing and this and that because they've switched from a different system. And I think whenever you get used to something, say a menu system, and you switch to a new one, of course it's going to be confusing because it works differently. And I think it just takes time to get used to it. That said, there isn't so much, it doesn't seem like the items are laid out in kind of a priority, normal priority basis. It's kind of just, they're laid out how they are, and you kind of have to get used to that. That said, once you kind of know what's important to you, you can save these items into like a My Menu tab. Now that's very useful because maybe you then only have, you know, the 10 things you change on an everyday kind of basis, and they're all on the same menu page. So when you're at that point, when you understand how the menu works and you're really able to customize this camera, you can really get the most out of it. And I think you need to do that to get the most out of this camera, being it is a completely menu-based camera. Now, that said, one of the biggest bummers to me about this camera is the electric viewfinder. You know, I love electric viewfinders. It's so nice to be able to look through. You see exactly your exposure, you see the colors, the richness, the crispness of the image. You can compose it, and okay, there's my photograph. Boom, you click that shutter button. In the A7iii, sorry. Yeah, I mean, it is not so crisp. I was just in the forest, there were leaves and branches on the ground. It was kind of dark, and I saw pixels, like they were all shining. And I'm not in manual mode, this isn't focus peaking. I was on autofocus, and this was happening. So it's not crisp enough to kind of give me the crispness that I want to see in an image. It's not a pleasure to look through and shoot a photograph, which is very unfortunate. And what ends up happening is I think, okay, this is a good photograph, I take the image, and then I have to later look on the computer, and I'm seeing like, oh wow, yeah, that came out really well. I'm surprised because in the electric viewfinder, you know, it didn't look so sharp or it didn't look so nice. And that's a bummer. You don't want that. You want the photographic experience with the camera to be the one that's really positive. Of course, you want your images to look good at the end also, but it shouldn't be that, you know, yeah, I don't know. It really needs to be upgraded there. And one thing is that on the 7R3, they do have that upgraded resolution that's comparable with the Fujifilm X-H1, which I absolutely love. It's like looking through a big fishbowl. The colors are rich, and it really is a joy to shoot with. So for me, that's a bummer, and it really makes that the pleasure of shooting with this camera less. I think in bright conditions, you don't really notice it so much, but when you get out into kind of dusk and dawn time or night, you will notice it, I think. Kind of on the same train of thought here, you have this articulating screen in the back. Now it's not fully articulated. It cannot go left or right. It can go 90 degrees up and about 45 degrees down. It's just under 1 million pixels, which isn't a lot either. So if you shoot with the electronic viewfinder or if you shoot through the screen, you're going to be kind of disappointed a little bit in either situation. That said, it's kind of ironic because at the end, the file you're getting is great. It's one of the best files you can get these days. So yeah, I wish they did make the photographic experience a bit nicer. It is a great image camera. It gives you great files. However, shooting with it could be more enjoyable. But that's what you get with the Sony. So you lose some things and you gain some things. You're going to get great files, but the experience might not be as enjoyable as one you might have with the Fujifilm. So it really depends upon what you want out of your photography. Now, you heard me just talk about the A7 III for a while, but I just want to bring you back to the X-H1 for a second. So, kind of going in the same order, the ergonomics here are absolutely incredible. My whole hand fits on this grip. It feels amazing. It is one of the nicest cameras I've held. I can feel very comfortable shooting one-handed, unlike the Sony where I feel like I need the support of my left hand. So from there, I really prefer the X-H1. My finger also falls directly on the shutter, and my thumb actually falls right on the wheel where I change my shutter speed. So that is a great combination. Talking about the shutter of the X-H1 is like beautiful. When you first use it, you might think it's too sensitive, but once you get used to it, it's great. And the sound it makes is just so soft. It's like leaves falling in the forest, whereas the Sony sounds like chopping down a tree. And I'll show you later what those actually sound like. But getting back to it, so unlike the Sony, you do have the knobs on the top to change your ISO and also your shutter speed if you like. You also have options to kind of do the same thing you do with the Sony's main knob. And you can also change your autofocus fields with a knob here. So it's a very tactile experience. That said, you do still have the ability to customize many of the buttons in the back. You even have a quick menu system where you can bring up things like you can, if you shoot in JPEG, you can change the color or the sharpness or noise reduction. You can set a self timer or change your white balance and things like this. So it also still has that menu-based system. What it doesn't have in comparison to the Sony are those customizable sets that are switched with a knob. Ironically enough, it does have customizable sets that you can change with the Q system of the camera. So you go into the Q menu and you can go to your custom set 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like this. Now, the viewfinder, as I said, is incredible on the X-H1. It's big and bright, it gives you rich colors, and is a joy to shoot through. The articulating screen also is a step up in resolution, and it also pops out in one direction but not the other. So it pops out a little bit this way, but it cannot go that way. So kind of a funny way to do it, but that's it. So a little better on the back screen and much better on that electronic viewfinder. Autofocus wise, it's good. I would not say it's at the level of the Sony. People say that the X-T30 and the X-T3 are now kind of on this level of autofocus. However, the X-H1 is behind the Sony in autofocus capability. When I'm shooting portraits, I often find it can find the face, no problem, but the eye is rather hard. So take that as you will, but overall, I think that this is also a super camera. And some things that I didn't mention when I was just talking about the Sony is that they both shoot 4K video. However, the X-H1 can actually shoot in 200 megabytes per second, so a little higher quality when there's a lot going on in your movie. That said, the Sony uses its full frame resolution and compresses a 6K image into a 4K image, which is also pretty great, and you get some very high quality. You get high quality video out of both of these cameras. Another thing that you might notice on the Fujis is that they have an aperture ring on most of their high quality lenses. So again, if you're that tactile shooter, Fujifilm is the way to go. One thing you will not be happy with, however, are these. In fact, I've already gone through one during this filming. So these batteries run out quite quickly, whereas the Sony, I think, is still at 60%. So the battery there is much better. However, if you don't mind carrying a couple around, then no problem. Both of these cameras have dual SD card slots. So you can, say for redundancy, you can split JPEGs and RAWs or photographs and movies. So that is great. Honestly, you're going to be happy with either of these cameras. You know, it's not the tool, but it's the user of the tool, as you might say. And that's true in this situation. They're both such good cameras that you can really get high quality video or high quality images out of either of them. So as I told you, the Fujifilm has a very nice shutter sound. This is the mic. I'm going to put the camera directly on the mic, and this is what it sounds like. That's a high burst mode. If I go into single shot, now I'll show you the Sony. Again, right next to the mic. That's pretty loud. And now let's go with the single. So you can kind of see the difference. Luckily, both have a silent shooting mode, but of course this electronic shutter doesn't work in all situations. If you are indoors, you might want to use a mechanical shutter if you have LED lights overhead or fluorescent lights overhead. But if you're at a wedding, you might want to shoot with that electronic shutter, especially when it sounds like this. That will also scare wildlife, so keep that in mind. But again, maybe the silent shutter is the option there. Point being is the Fuji has a much nicer sounding shutter than the Sony does. Quickly circling back around to that electronic viewfinder, there's one thing I forgot to mention, which actually is in favor of the Sony. Now, this would be particularly interesting for you if you shoot a lot with, say, adapted lenses, which you use manual focus, if you like manual focus in general, or if you just like looking to check if your autofocus is actually nailing what it should before you push the shutter button. This is about the focus magnifier. Now, Fuji and Sony both offer a focus magnifier in their camera bodies. However, the Fuji uses some sort of weird digital zoom, and it doesn't actually show you what the image will look like in the end. So that means the thing that should be intact focus is just slightly less blurry than the things around it. Now, the Sony actually uses the real image, so you can really nail exactly what you want to be intact focus. You can do this at 5.9 magnification or at 11 times magnification. Now that's pretty cool. I just wish they gave us the viewfinder to go with this cool feature. So in the end, where does this leave us? Do we choose the Fuji or do we go with the Sony? Now, they both have pluses and minuses, just like everything in life. If you're someone who likes a really tactile photographic experience, you know, you like knobs, changing the ISO and the shutter speed on the camera, if you like aperture rings on your lenses, if you shoot mostly JPEG, if you want a really rich viewfinder and have a very just a very pleasant shooting experience, I would recommend you the Fuji. That said, of course, you can also have a good time shooting with the Sony. I just think that the Fuji body offers a little more in that direction. Now, the Sony might offer you a bit better video quality, having that full frame 6K image being downgraded into the 4K. You get some really high quality there. Also, you might get some edges in certain low light situations. But overall, I felt like the photo quality was quite equal between the two. There were a few images that we looked through together where the Sony had a clear edge, and it seemed like that probably was maybe a misfunction of the autofocusing system that didn't really lock on to those focus points. Even though I had single point focus and it gave me the green square, it didn't seem, I can't believe that the lens was simply so unsharp in those situations. So I think it was something probably with the autofocus system, which still in itself is a plus for the Sony. They do have the better autofocus system. So if that's important to you, that would be another reason to pick the Sony. Now, they both shoot at high frame rates. The Sony at 10, and in performance boost mode, which drains the battery even more, the Fuji X-H1 can do 11. It does 8 natively. So they both have respectable frames per second. Of course, the A9 from Sony can get 20 frames per second. Something to think about if you're into action sports photography. But in the end, perhaps an unsatisfactory answer to this question is that they're both great cameras. They really are. And I think you'll be happy with either one of them. And if you already have one of them, I mean, you can do what I just did and get both, try them, hold them in your hands, and then make that decision for yourself. But I think on paper there is some difference. But I think in practice, they're both so good. And at this point, it really isn't about the equipment. It's about the photographer and which camera is the better tool for your photographic needs. So in the end, like I said, you'll be happy with either of them. But I'm really interested in which one you will pick. And if you already have one of them, what's your experience with it? If you tried both of them, what do you notice that the differences are between them? Go ahead and leave that down in the comments below, and I'd love to chat with you about it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you made it this far, give me a like, subscribe if you haven't done that already. I really like making these videos, but of course they take a lot of time and effort, and I hope they're as helpful to you as they are to me. I think myself, I'm going to have to watch this video to decide which of these two cameras I'm going to keep in the end. But whichever one it is, I'm going to have fun shooting with it. So until next time, guys, see you.